Start tonight by joining with other members in the House in expressing my own sympathy to the families of the 29 miners whose lives have been confirmed as lost at Pike River. In Christchurch, over the last 3 months, we've had our own share of heartbreak, but it is nothing like what the families must be going through tonight over on the coast and in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. Mercifully and miraculously, there was no life lost at all in the September 4th earthquake in Canterbury, and that's in a city of around 400,000 people and a wider province. So when we have confirmed tonight the loss of those 29 lives and a population on the west coast of, I guess, fewer than 30,000 people, it brings home to us how every coaster will be touched by this tragedy in some way, personal way or another. And I think the hearts of all members of this House will go out to that community tonight. It does, of course, make the job of considering a rather dry technical tax bill a little harder, but that's the duty of this Parliament tonight. This bill is, as I mentioned, makes some rather technical changes to tax legislation. And the timing of it was rather interesting because it sort of came into the House and was passed to the Finance and Expenditure Committee as the government was considering and then introducing the GST tax changes to take GST to 15%. And although it's quite a separate matter, obviously this bill does remind us of the other GST changes. And I do note the very recent public opinion poll which shows that 53%, no less than 53% of New Zealanders are feeling no better off from the tax changes which were at the heart of the increase of GST to 15% and allied cuts in personal tax. And this bill deals more broadly with taxation, and we do note that throughout the earlier part of this year, both the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister were talking about how the tax system was a very powerful lever in the economy. And we saw in this year's budget those tax cuts for those on high incomes. And the legacy, I think, of that budget has in fact been higher prices across the board and not the impact in terms of the recovery that was expected. We were predicted by the Prime Minister to be growing aggressively out of the recession, but in fact that's flattened off, and I think the words of the Reserve Bank on that are now a tepid, if not fragile, recovery. So tax cuts as introduced by the budget are not making any particular impact in respect of the economic recovery. To this bill and its amendments to KiwiSaver, a number of technical amendments, and it was with some regret that we note the government did not take the opportunity to use this bill to undo some of the damage that it did under urgency in this House 2 years ago when it took apart the KiwiSaver regime. And interesting to note, in Select Committee today we had the Retirement Commissioner talking about the 3 pillars that were at the heart of changes to how we approach superannuation in this country. The first being, of course, private savings, the second being the national superannuation, and the third leg of it, I guess, being what KiwiSaver had introduced. And yet we note that KiwiSaver, of course, has been gutted under this government, and that was, in fact, the first real attempt by us as a nation to try and lift private sector household savings in New Zealand, to try and get somewhere close to Australia where they have hundreds of billions of dollars in savings generated through their savings scheme. They're a 9% employer contribution, a much wealthier nation, I'd acknowledge, and that's why KiwiSaver, as introduced by the past Labor government, had a graduated scheme with a 1% rising employer contribution over 4 years to a 4% contribution. Not compulsory, people were able to opt out if they chose, but the scheme was designed to encourage people to come in, and I think at last count about 1.5 million New Zealanders nearly have taken up the KiwiSaver scheme, so its popularity is certainly there, and it is with regret that we saw those cuts, and we thought this bill might be a chance for the government to acknowledge, because just as the bill was coming through the Select Committee, the government acknowledged to the nation that we needed to do better in savings. We needed to do considerably better in savings. And if we needed an underlining of that, it came in the last few days with the decision of Standard & Poor's to put this country on negative credit outlook. And the reason they did that was our poor savings record as a nation. But nothing in this bill in respect of reversing those cuts to KiwiSaver, regrettably. These are technical amendments. And what KiwiSaver had done, I think, was really begun the process of turning around our savings problem as a nation. And of course it was allied with the Cullen Fund, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, and regrettably also that other pillar, if you like, of our savings, our attempt to ensure that the baby boomers amongst us will be able to have some more security from national super when retirement day comes. And of course that fund is starting to pick up in terms of the return that it's making after, like every other fund in the world, having been affected by the vagaries of the world economic crisis in 2008-9. And the thing that I'd like to note to the House tonight is that the changes that this government has made in respect of savings, both with KiwiSaver and with the Cullen Fund, the Super Fund, is really part of a pattern, in my view, that goes back for more than 30 years. In 1974, and he's still a member of this House, and I acknowledge this, Roger Douglas, now Sir Roger, working in the Kirk Rolling government, was the architect of the superannuation scheme. It was a contributory scheme, and if that had still been in place today, I believe we would be a wealthy nation. And you look at Australia, and often people point to the minerals of Australia as the basis of its wealth, and sure, that's a very, very good fundamental for the Australian economy. But in fact, the Australian savings regime, which gives them the power and clout to withstand some of the shocks that we've seen over the last couple of years, are a very important component of the fundamental strength of the Australian economy. And it's a fundamental strength we don't have, and regrettably we could have had, if that scheme had not been abolished in what was a blatant attempt to buy an election in 1975, a blatant attempt, and it didn't stop there, because in 1990, after Labor had made some brave changes in office to national superannuation, Jim Bolger, the then national leader, campaigned on returning that scheme back in a no if, buts or maybes promise. And in fact he then reversed that promise and made some cuts to the superannuation scheme, the national super. And of course we've come right up to this day where we see the cuts to KiwiSaver and to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. And obviously those...
Point of order.
Mr Speaker, I'd suggest that the member has drifted somewhat further than the ambit of the bill we're discussing.
1975.
History. Order. I'm on my feet. A second reading, and members should look at a Speaker's rulings, is about the bill and the principles of the bill. Now, there is tolerance to allow comparisons to be made and drawn back, but to just get into a general debate, which is historical, is outside the scope of the bill. So the member should make his comparisons and come back to the bill.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So there's the history. There is the history of this government's, this National Party's government's record on superannuation and saving. And here was an opportunity under this bill to make some changes, but in fact it hasn't done that. But what the bill does do is introduce zero rating transactions involving land, and that's a good thing to see. We do think that the Select Committee might have considered zero rating for fruit and vegetables, to try and take some of the sting off the increases in GST that have been introduced. And obviously the government was very willing to discuss every other aspect of the GST scheme, and that was brought in through this bill, some further technical changes to this bill. Those prices are rising pretty strongly, but no move in this bill to address GST on fresh fruit and vegetables. It does go to the zero rating of transactions involving land, and that's welcome. Those technical amendments are important.